Welcome back, everyone. We're going to look at cutting an onion. And onions are one of the most common things that we're cutting up in kitchens. And oftentimes we might want them pretty small or maybe a little bit bigger, depending on what we're making. If we're making some soup and we want some more texture in it, we might cut them a little bit bigger. Whereas if we're going to be making a sauce and maybe pureeing them in, we might be cutting them smaller. So how do we deal with this circular thing that has a whole bunch of layers, essentially? So first of all, we got to peel it. So peeling it, if you take, and there's two ends to an onion. This end used to stick up out of the ground, and if you let an onion keep growing, it'll produce a flower and some seeds. And then this end used to be, the whole thing was in the ground, right? And this end is where all the roots were in the ground. So we want to cut off the end that was sticking up first. And if you cut about 2/3 of the way through it, not all of it, and pull it back and pull down, a lot of times that will reveal how thick this is. And that way you don't waste as much of the onion by peeling off too much. So if I just take that and then I take a paring knife and I pull down this outer layer, then I can get that outer part of the onion that is hard and that we're not going to use off. So I'll pull all that down toward the root. So notice I haven't cut the other side yet. Sometimes you'll see people just cut them in half and then peel them. That works. One consideration in doing that is if you cut it in half, the outside might be dirty, and usually we don't wash off the outside of the onions. You can't really clean the skin very easily, and so you could be contaminating the inside of it a bit. So it's best to do it like this. And then if I just pull that off, I'm going to end up with just that root end sticking out. So I don't have any more of that. There is layers on the onions on the inside. There's a kind of slippery membrane. So if you do have any of that, you can see it. I have some of it on this one right here. So I'd take that off because otherwise they're slippery and that makes them a little more dangerous to cut. So then I want to cut off that root, but I don't want to cut it off deep into the onion. I just want to cut off the top part of the root. So I don't have any of that dirt section there, but I still have the root section holding all the layers of the onion together. So I'm going to take and just shave that off so you can see now that I don't have any of that root section. I have a little bit. Cut that off. But I still do have that root right there that is going to hold all the layers of the onion together while I cut it. So set this aside and let me wipe off my cutting board. So good mise en place, or having everything in its place, is to have some soap, soapy water and towels and sanitizer right with me so that I can clean off my station anytime I need to. So I've got some towels here. Dry that off. Okay, so now I've got my onion peeled. And if I want to dice this, then let me just rinse off my knife. If I want to dice this, then I'm going to cut it in half first, right through the root. So I'm looking at the root side. I'm not looking at that other side here. And I'm going to cut it in half right through that root. And we'll set one half aside. And then let's say I want to make this small dice, right? Or macédoine. That would be a common size that I might use in a soup. And so if I wanted to do that, remember that means 1/4 of an inch by 1/4 of an inch by 1/4 of an inch cube. This is not going to make all cubes because it's not square. Usually we don't square off an onion because you're not going to end up with perfectly even slices anyhow because there's layers, right? But that doesn't mean we can't make it as close to the same size as possible so that it cooks evenly. And that's really what our goal is when we're cooking it. So if I wanted to do that, what I'm going to do is I need to put my cutting board at the edge of the table I'm standing at. And I have the root end toward the left of me. I'm cutting with my right hand. If I was cutting with my left hand, it would be exactly the opposite. And I want to take my knife, hold it the way that we've talked about holding it, and I'm going to put my hand that I'm not cutting with on top of the onion and push it down. And my fingers, I'm going to stick them up in the air. I don't want to get lazy with my fingers and have them down, because then they're at risk. If I keep them up, when I make a cut this way, if I cut too hard and I come all the way through the onion, my hand's safe. Okay, if I don't and I have fingers hanging down, then my hand is not safe. So I'm going to take, and I want to make cuts about every 1/4 of an inch. And in this case, this is one of those times where I pull back instead of moving forward. I still want to use the sharpness of the knife, but if for one thing, notice I'm at the very edge of the cutting board. If I go over here and I try to do this, my hand is in the way of me getting this knife flat. I want to be able to get the knife flat, so I keep it over on the edge, and that way I can put the edge of my knife right up against that onion, pull through, and I'm pushing a little bit to get it to go through that onion, but I don't have to push a lot. My knife's pretty sharp, that's part of the reason, but also, again, that motion of me pulling it back will use the sharpness of the blade, and it'll make it easier to cut. So I just made a bunch of cuts about a 1/4 of an inch apart that are stacking essentially from the bottom of this onion. So now if I turn it, now the root's faced away from me. So it's over here. Now I want, and when I made that other cut that I didn't point out, I don't want to go all the way through, because it helps hold the onion together. It's easier to cut. If I go all the way through, I have a whole bunch of pieces of onion. It's much harder to cut. So now if I turn it the other way, so again, the root's facing away from me, and now I'm going to do the same thing. I'm not going to cut all the way through. This is one of the few times where I almost go straight down, because I don't want to cut sections of the onion off. So I'm going to, every 1/4 of an inch, I've got my fingers turned under with my offhand. I'm going to cut down every 1/4 of an inch. Some little pieces might come off as you're doing it. It's okay, just leave them. And again, I'm not cutting all the way through the onion. So now I've cut it a 1/4 of an inch this way, and I've cut it a 1/4 of an inch this way. I did it like that. So now if I turn it 90 degrees, all those cuts that I just made are now facing that way. And I do it one more time. So I make that cut 1/4 of an inch. And notice I'm moving forward as I do it. Then I've got this pretty consistent cubed onion. It's not a perfect cube. You're going to end up with this other piece. That's the end. So that I would just take and cut it about a 1/4 of an inch thick. I'm rocking through it there to do that. And cut this one more time, about a 1/4 of an inch. And with that, and that little bit of scrap that I had of pieces that fell off, I've got a pretty consistent 1/4 inch dice of onion to use in whatever it is I'm making. So that is how you would dice an onion. And let me move this out of the way, and I'll show you how you would slice an onion. One thing when you're cutting, and I really should have had another container here. I don't. But I don't want anything on my cutting board where I'm cutting. Because if there's little pieces of stuff over here and I'm cutting, your knife can hit it and slide, and it might slide toward your hand and end up cutting yourself. So you always want to make sure that you've got ample space on your cutting board for whatever it is you're cutting. So if I wanted to slice this, I just want to, instead of dicing, I just want to slice it and cut it thin. Then first of all, there's that root piece right here on it that I want to take out. So I'm going to wedge that out. So I get that out of there, and I don't have any root pieces. By the way, the one that I diced, this was the end, which is just, again, that root piece. And then this is one of the times where we might use a chopping motion when we're cutting. And I know that contradicts a little bit what I talked about before about wanting to go forward. So I could do this by slicing forward like this and slice it. But an onion's not that dense to cut. And if my knife's sharp enough and I've got good position on it, I can cut through it by just cutting straight down. I can do it faster, right? And oftentimes Oftentimes we're trying to do whatever's the fastest in kitchens, but that'll give me just a quick sliced onion. Now, when I do that, notice I turn my fingers underneath, and so I don't have to worry about cutting my knuckles or anything, because I've got my knife right up against it. I can feel where my knife is, and that's kind of the quick way of slicing. Again, we could do that motion moving forward. So dicing, slicing onions, after peeling them, that's how we do it. So stay tuned for some other knife skills.